afternoon and welcome to Carleton University, Mr. Janzen.
Thank you.
I've already identified you, William Janzen. So I'm assuming that you're a native of Canada?
Yes, I was born in Saskatchewan and
Okay.
grew up here, yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, and you've been a member of the Mennonite community?
That's correct. I am a member of the Mennonite community, yes.
So let me begin by asking you, could you provide us with a brief history of the establishment of the Mennonite community in Canada?
Yes. The history goes back quite a ways, back to the 1700s, when the first Mennonites came from Pennsylvania to what was then Upper Canada and settled in both in the Niagara Peninsula, in the Waterloo-Kitchener area, and in just north of Toronto by Markham and Stouffville. Then, about 100 years later, in the 1870s, there was quite a group that came from Russia. The Mennonites began in the 1500s in Europe, in the Germanic areas of Europe, Germany, Holland, Switzerland, and then some of them ended up moving to Russia, my own ancestors, for example, but others moved to Pennsylvania in the late 1600s already. So those, the ones from Pennsylvania are the ones who came to Upper Canada. Then those from Russia in the 1870s began to come to, first of all, to Manitoba, and then my ancestors moved on to Saskatchewan around the 1900, and that's where I was born and grew up. Then there were another sizable group, 21,000, that came also from Russia in the 1920s, right after the Communist Revolution, and they came as refugees and had a very dramatic rescue that influenced their sensitivity towards refugees from then on. My parents-in-law were both born in Russia. They were small children at the time and came to Canada in the 1920s. And the Mennonites who were already here helped them to come here. And so and then there were more that came after World War II. Now, however, what I've said so far is those Mennonites were largely Germanic. Some were more German, some Swiss, Dutch, but they were Germanic. Now, however, there's a lot more diversity, as there is in many other groups in Canada. And, for example, the Mennonite worship services in Canada on any given Sunday morning, you could find them in 20 different languages. Vietnamese, Chinese, Spanish, French, Oromo, Chin, Amharic, and so on. So it's much more diverse, as the rest of Canada is too. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that. Mm-hmm. So there was already a spirit of welcoming individuals to Canada in the Mennonite community. In the 70s and 80s, of course, the country was confronted with the Southeast Asian crisis. And my question to you is, I'm assuming that the Mennonite community had an interest in helping out that community at the time. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. There would be two factors that I would point to. One is an outgrowth of the answer that I gave about the fact that Mennonites had come as refugees after World War I, some 21,000, and then after World War II, another 8,000. And in both of those instances, the Mennonites who were already in Canada had assumed a large responsibility in getting them settled and paying for all kinds of costs. And those were huge undertakings. But so there was an experience. There was also, particularly those who came in the 1920s and also those in the 1940s, an experience of fleeing from a communist government. They had when the communist government took over in Russia, then religion was suppressed, and church services had to be canceled, and even the schools in these Mennonite, the teachers couldn't teach what they had been teaching, and so on. So, the property was taken over by collectivization programs. So, people were suffering economically as well as socially, and so there was that kind of sensitivity. The other thing that I would point to is that the Mennonite Central Committee, now I should point out, at a certain level it's a binational committee, the Canadian and the American, and have been working internationally since 1920. And starting out in Russia, but also in many other parts of the world, in the Middle East and Africa. But in Vietnam, the Mennonite Central Committee had been working since 1954. So there was then, by 79, a 25-year history of Mennonite Central Committee's involvement in Vietnam. And so the supporting churches who were providing donations and providing personnel for the work had heard about Vietnam. And of course, the huge American military involvement had been debated. And, there was a lot of anti-war sentiment in the Mennonite community, as there were other places, and there were other people who felt, there's a communist threat and it needs to be, this was the only way to deal with it. So there was a lot of debate. And so the Vietnam was on the consciousness of a lot of Mennonite people. So that created a certain, both of these factors, the experience of Mennonites in Canada with being refugees and with helping their own, provided a certain receptivity, yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. So I'm assuming that the next step then in the planning to welcome refugees into the country was to create some kind of an agreement or an understanding with the federal government at the time. Could you speak to that?
Yes. One little word of background first. In the late 70s, the government had changed in Vietnam in 75, and MCC, the Mennonite Central Committee, had continued to provide some aid to Vietnam. We didn't want to, unlike most of the Western world, we didn't want to walk away from Vietnamese people categorically, though with the new communist government, there were a lot of, the conditions were, it was not easy to work to provide assistance to Vietnam. But then, after a few years in the later 70s, there were people fleeing from Vietnam in small boats and at huge risk to themselves. And, that was on the news, and people were seeing that night after night, and you couldn't be unmoved by seeing that. So especially late in 78. So then our organization, the Mennonite Central Committee Canada, which was my employer at the time, we had our annual meeting at that time in Calgary in January of 79. And so here the church was full of people saying, when will you make an arrangement so we can help these people? We have to help these people. We cannot do nothing, seeing the terrible things that are happening. And so I was given firm instructions to go back to Ottawa as soon as the annual meeting was over and to work out some kind of an arrangement so that our churches could bring over the people somewhat as they had done just 30 years earlier with their own people after World War II and 50 years earlier after World War I. So those things were fresh in their memories. And so what happened then was that the federal government had just brought in a new immigration law that had a provision for private sponsorship of refugees. The work that the Mennonite people had done after World War II and after World War I was a kind of sponsorship, but it was different, but it was certainly the kind where we accepted a lot of responsibility for getting people settled. But now there was a kind of a new formula, and so there was, the government came, the government was somewhat prepared in terms of its legal framework to be open to groups. And so I came back to Ottawa in late January, and I had a good contact in I think he was Assistant Deputy Minister, Calbert Best. He was an African Canadian from Atlantic Canada, Nova Scotia, I think, and you know, I'd had some contact with him in the previous year or so, so we weren't totally new to each other. So I called him and explained what were the instructions that I had been given by my people, and they said, "Come on, let's meet, and we can work something out." And so then, you know, our organization, Mennonite Central Community of Canada, the head office was in Winnipeg, so I communicated back, and then we arranged a date, and some of my colleagues from Winnipeg came, and then Cal Best had several of his staff there, and so we sketched out a broad agreement. So I think the government or these officials were also quite ready to move forward. I mean, they were human beings, and they wanted, they were not cold-hearted to the suffering that they were seeing. Plus, there was a certain amount of political pressure. Some members of Parliament were asking the government, "What are you doing? When are you going to do something?" You know. So here was something that could be done. So the officials were quite receptive. Yeah.
And was Mr. Best with the Ministry of Employment and Immigration at the time?
Yes, Mr. Best was with the Employment and Immigration Commission. Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
So then, eventually, my understanding is you would have signed a formal contract with the federal government.
Yes, we, you know, in that first meeting, which I believe took place on February 2nd, with several immigration people and several of our people, we sketched the broad outlines, and then two of us, myself from our side, and Gordon Barnett, a government official, we were given the task of writing it up and clearly identifying what each side would do and when we would do it, and the flow of communications and what would happen, where, and so on. And so we then met, Gordon and I met a number of times, and we would always check back with our colleagues, of course. And it didn't take too long. We had an agreement, and then our board approved it, and the minister approved it, and then on March 5, it was formally signed in our Winnipeg head office. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So things are starting to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Should I assume that at some point the Mennonite community, because my understanding was that there was a national program and also a local program. The local Mennonite communities would have worked more directly with the refugees.
Yes, that is definitely the case. In fact, the national organization didn't work so directly. It was a facilitating function. What happened is that in the government's law, the provision was that any 5 Canadians can sponsor a refugee, but they would have to accept full liability. And that question of full liability made a lot of people hesitate. So now, we as a national organization, we're saying that, hey, we will accept full liability for any group whom we authorize. Now, at that time, there were probably about 600 Mennonite churches in Canada, British Columbia to Ontario, some in Atlantic Canada and Quebec, but more in Ontario and Western Canada. And so if say, the church in which I grew up in Saskatchewan would contact the Mennonite Central Committee office and say, we would like to sponsor a family of refugees, then Mennonite Central Committee would send a letter of authorization to that congregation in Saskatchewan. And that congregation would then, that church would then take that letter to the immigration office in Saskatoon, and then the officials in the immigration office would see, oh yeah, this group is good. They are backed up. They have resources. They will. We don't have to screen them. We don't have to check them out. They will be reliable because we as a national organization had assumed full liability for everything. And so, but it was that little church in Saskatchewan that did the work. Yeah. And so that immigration office in Saskatoon would then wire the head office, which would wire the embassy in Thailand, and would say, find a family of X number of people and get them on the plane and so on. And so, there was definitely the local level, and I think, our people in our head office worked very hard to make sure that everything worked well, because usually when you work with people, there are some things that you don't expect, and needs arise, and you try to find places where you can get language training or translators and interpreters and a lot of things. So it wasn't as if our national office did nothing, but in terms of directly helping people to find housing and helping refugee children to enroll in schools and things like that, that hands-on work, that was done at a local level. Yeah. Yes.
My other question is, should I assume that there would have been members of the Mennonite community that would have been present in refugee camps, for example, working alongside with the federal government to prepare the entry of refugees into the country? Would that have gone on?
Yes, we did have that. I don't think nearly all organizations did, but we already had workers in Southeast Asia, in Thailand, Bangkok, and other parts of that region. And so when we were the first to sign this agreement, and we wanted our workers to be involved, and the Canadian Embassy people were very open to it because they wanted it to succeed. So our workers were involved in filling the requests, and the cooperation was quite remarkable. It was not at all an adversarial relationship. No, it was,
So once that plan is in place, then the Mennonite community and the federal government in partnership are prepared to welcome refugees into the country. Mm-hmm. And as you said, many of those families, individuals, mm-hmm. would have been invited to live in communities, in Mennonite communities that were already prepared to receive them.
Yes.
Could you talk about that process?
To say that they were prepared, I would say they were willing, they were eager to be helpful. What people discovered was that you have you may have the best of intentions, but if you're a rural church, you may not find language translators to facilitate in that, and the refugees, they before long it became evident that they really preferred to live in cities where they were closer to other people from their own background, and that was totally understandable. So, in a sense, for a small church to be fully prepared was they were definitely willing. There's a story of one rural church where the family, the hosting people picked up the family at the airport in the evening, and then drove out late in the evening for several hours to their community. But for these people, they were very afraid of the dark. In their culture, the dark, there were evil things in the dark. And, nobody was aware of that, and nobody could explain that. And then the next day, I guess they hadn't had everything in the house quite ready yet. And, in a rural area, you don't always have water and sewage systems. So here were a bunch of the men from the Mennonite community. They were going to build a septic tank. And what do you do to build a septic tank? You dig a big hole. So they were out there with a front end digger and digging a hole, and wanted to get the septic tank hooked up, and so on. But these refugees thought, hey, they're building graves to bury us. And it had taken several hours before they finally found a translator to come to that rural community to explain that no, that wasn't the intent. So there were, it was the best of intentions, yes. But to be fully prepared for everything, not everything worked smoothly, right. Despite the best of intentions on all sides. Yeah. It
would have been an interesting learning experience for the different.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. The other question I wanted to ask you was, during that period, would the Mennonite community have formed partnerships with other church groups or service clubs, or to work with the refugees that were being invited to come live in the country?
We, as a Mennonite Central Committee, the organization at a national level, we certainly interacted with, the United Church, the Anglican Church, Catholic groups, but the more significant partnerships were often at the local level, where, and they still are. I, for example, I'm here with the Ottawa Mennonite Church, and we sponsor people, and we have relationships with several different community groups here in Ottawa who work with us in sponsoring families. So, and that has gone on from the beginning, that a local church will make an arrangement with a local United Church or Catholic group or community group to do something jointly. So yeah, there's been a lot of that. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So could you talk about what would have happened? I'm assuming that at the national level there was an interest by other parties to get involved with inviting refugees to Canada, like the churches, etc. Could you talk about what that experience was like?
Yes, happily. Obviously Mennonites have no monopoly on compassion at all. Wouldn't for a minute say that. People were watching the same news as we were, and people were moved. And so almost immediately after we had signed our agreement, I was getting phone calls from other churches saying, what is this that you've signed? What did you do? Can you send us a copy? And so within a month, there were several other people that had signed. Within 2 months, there were more than a dozen national organizations that had signed the identical agreement with the government. So it really moved forward, and the government officials were amazed at the interest in the privately sponsored avenue. The they had, the government officials in their records, as late as June, they were still talking about getting a total of 12,000 into Canada from Southeast Asia. That was an improvement of what they had talked about in January and February, but only 12,000. They expected 4,000 to be privately sponsored, and the government would take 12,000. Then at the end of July, when Flora MacDonald was Minister of Foreign Affairs, she raised it to 50,000. Now, one interesting thing that happened there was that, and I've discussed this with Mike Malloy, who's an immigration official, was that one of my colleagues was traveling from our Winnipeg head office. John Wheeler was traveling in the area in Southeast Asia, and he came back, this was in early July, and said, Canada could take far more. We could take 25,000, we could take 50,000. And so I raised the question, could it be that Flora MacDonald got the number of 50,000 from there, because John Wheeler was interviewed by Maclean's magazine, and that's where he used that number, 50,000. And Mike Malloy said it's very possible that certainly influenced her in picking that number. But then it continued, and by the end of 1980, Canada had brought in 70,000, and about half of them were privately sponsored, by all kinds of groups. We had sponsored about 5,000, but other groups were very active as well. So it really demonstrated, that here was something where the energy of local groups, churches in this case particularly, but also other local groups, the energy was not entirely constrained or restricted. There was a certain freedom of energy, and it was not simply a matter of implementing government policy. It was acting in a way that, in a genuine partnership. We as private groups were players in our own right on the scene, albeit not totally independently of the government. The people had to be screened by the government and so on. But it was a remarkable partnership in the sense of that the energy of the private groups could be applied and could be expressed. So I think that's a truly significant thing in terms of Canada's political culture. That private groups can do things on their own, not simply as implementing government policy, but as doing what they choose to do. I think that's a very valuable element of of Canada's political culture, and that was demonstrated in this partnership. So I think it was a rich experience in that way. Yeah.
Out of curiosity, did the Mennonite community keep any records of the numbers of refugees that they would have helped? Yes, there are records. I must say too that as proud as grateful as I am for the large response of that time, it did fall down quite a lot a few years later, some churches, our own here in Ottawa, continued in a steady pace, but many of the rural churches felt, we're not well suited to this kind of work. And it really picked up again with the Syrian response in more recent years, and it reached a very high number again. And still the sponsorship has never completely stopped. There have always been a significant number of sponsorships. Right. Yeah, there's a continued involvement by the Mennonite community. Very significantly, yeah. Okay. And I should say that we have, there was, this relates to an earlier question. Some years after my time, at the time when we negotiated that agreement, we called it a master agreement.
Later on, they were renamed Sponsorship Agreement Holders, SAH. And so then there was a kind of a coordinating council of the different sponsorship agreement holders in Canada, and we were very active in that council, and together that council negotiated and discussed various concerns with government officials. One concern that's kind of inherent in the problem, in the process, is that very soon after you bring people over, they will want to say, hey, I have a sister and a brother and an uncle and an aunt. And our churches would be very happy to try to sponsor them. But that really restricted the government's freedom to respond simply on a needs basis or on whatever other basis. So that there was a real, at the very beginning, that difference didn't matter. It hadn't surfaced as an issue. But later on, it became a problem. And so it took a while to find a modicum of whereby the government and the sponsorship agreement holders could work together without getting bogged down on that issue. But that was a problem that emerged in later years. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So my final question is, are you ever offered opportunities as a member of the Mennonite community to talk about what the experience would have been like in the 70s and 80s working with Southeast refugees? And if you do, what would you usually talk about?
Well, I certainly talk about the agreement and that we were able to work out something with the government that worked.
Yeah.
And I mean, we all hear stories of governmental regulations that don't work. At least that's what we, as citizens, often complain about more than we perhaps should. But here was something that sort of worked reasonably well. And then the energy that came from grassroots people, ordinary people, they really wanted to do something. They wanted, there's a lot of goodwill out there that should never be underestimated. People want to do at least something for the sake of humanity. And there's another thing that I would that I try to refer to. That relates to the fact that many people could not come. What about those who stayed back? What about those who never managed who maybe he didn't find enough money to pay the owners of those little boats to get them to the next shore? And we, as I mentioned, as an organization, we tried to remain involved in Vietnam itself, even while we were helping Vietnamese people to come to Canada. To some of those who came in Canada, I think, questioned, what are you doing? You're helping a very oppressive government become more oppressive. And I don't want to downplay what those re-education camps were all about. A lot of people, teachers, church ministers, pastors, they were sent to re-education camps where not only were they told to behave in certain ways, they were told to think in certain ways. I find that so difficult. I can understand why a government might want me to refrain from certain behaviors, but I'd like to keep my own capacity to think my own thoughts about what is right and wrong. But that government was a heavy-handed government in that way. And nevertheless, we try to remain involved. And I think we need to remember, and Canada has become more active. And like Canada did have an embargo against, we for many years we couldn't, we used our own church money to provide assistance in Vietnam, but we couldn't use any CETA money. We could use CETA money in the Middle East and Africa and Latin America, but not in Vietnam. And eventually, I worked on that here in Ottawa for a long time, and the government agreed, okay, we will let you use CETA money in Vietnam as you do elsewhere in your work. But that was it's one small way of saying that, okay, these people, they're under a very different political regime, a harsh political regime, but they're still people. And it just behooves us, it just seems important to try to relate to them. And despite the political differences, and to seek to find ways, however small, to build on our common humanity. And so I try to say that, yeah, helping refugees come to Canada and get resettled here is a large part of the story, but it's not the whole of the story. There is another part that we need to keep in mind. And I think some of those of the people who were resettled here have gone back and have worked there and helped Vietnamese communities there. And so there's been quite a significant second chapter of the movement this way. And I can't be more than happy about that. So those are some things I try to emphasize. That, there are the stories of enormous accomplishment. Many of the people, they were very determined, incredibly hardworking, and they advanced to senior levels. And there's a friend of mine in Saskatchewan, a woman my age, who was very active in sponsoring refugees. Years later, she needed specialist medical care. Lo and behold, the physician who attended her was a son of a family that she had sponsored. It was amazing things like that, and that would be exceptional. But many other friendships have developed. People have, we in the Mennonite world, we certainly had our Christian faith and would have welcomed Vietnamese, and some became part of our faith community. But we never made that a stipulation. And there have been friendships where the families who were sponsored were invited to weddings and to funerals and to, of other religions. And it's really been, in many ways, stretching and broadening, but also making all of us more aware of our common humanity. And that, a little bit of assistance at a certain time in our lives has a lot of implications. Yeah, thank you.
So to this day, in 2019, the Mennonite community is still involved in the Asian community and in Vietnam?
Yes, we are in Vietnam and here. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much.
It's a pleasure.